In this video, I'm going to talk about the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act. These were two crucial laws passed by the US Congress in 1862, which had a profound impact on the colonization and settlement of the American West. The Homestead Act of 1862 was designed to encourage individuals to become farmers on the Great Plains. It said that anyone who had not taken up arms against the US could claim 160 acres of land on the plains free as long as they agreed to farm it for 5 years. Now that of course would exclude later the Confederate soldiers that had fought against the United States during the Civil War. The aim of the Homestead Act was to ensure that the West was settled by lots of individual farmers, rather than having the land bought up by a few very rich landowners. There was restrictions placed on how many claims one person could take up. And this, of course, goes back to the ideals of American capitalism, which is that what is ideal is to have lots of very small businesses competing with each other to try to deliver a good price for the consumer. Of course, in reality, what happens in America and in capitalist societies is that we see the domination of large companies that seemingly are able to control the market and charge whatever price they want. And we'll see something similar happening with the Homestead Act. The intentions often don't meet up with the reality. Now, anyone could file a claim as long as they were the head of a family or single and over 21. That could include women who were single and over 21, or if you were under 21 but an ex-soldier. So this meant that slaves, ex-slaves rather, freed slaves from the South, as well as single women could file claims, which might not seem all that radical, but in the context of the 1860s it probably was. Now, did it work? Did the Homestead Act work? Well, you can have a go at the task here, by the way, to summarise the key points of this slide in 50 words or less, if you like, as a bit of revision. My sort of view on this is broadly speaking, it wasn't all that successful. It kind of looked more successful than it was, and it probably didn't meet up to the original aims that the Republican President Lincoln and congressmen that dominated the wartime US Congress had for it. Now, by 1876, over 6 million acres of government land had successfully become homesteads. Parts of the plains were settled for the first time, so Nebraska particularly benefited. Half of all the settled land in the Nebraska Territory was homestead land, and it would become a state in 1867, shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War. The Homestead Act encouraged immigration from Europe by 1875. More than half of Nebraska's population of 123,000 were recent immigrants or their children. And the arrival of homesteaders and their abilities to figure out the problems of farming on the plains helped make the plains easier to farm overall. However, that obscures the fact that it was really hard to farm the land on the plains. Only 13 million acres of claims have been proved up by 1884, where they kind of people had seen out the 5 years and been able to claim that land as theirs. Many people tried and failed and had to go back home to the east. Only 80 million acres of 500 million was successfully homesteaded. Far more land was in fact given to the railroad companies. 300 million acres was given to the railroad companies, and the rest was sold for higher prices, often to the big cattle ranchers. So what we see, we said before, didn't we, that what they wanted was lots of small farms, individuals running small farms. That was the aim, but the reality was that large amounts of land ultimately came under the control of very wealthy elite in the West. 60% of homestead claims were actually never successfully proved up because of how hard it was to farm the land. And ultimately, as I say, despite the government's intention that the Homestead Act would produce lots of individual family farms, rich landowners were able to manipulate the terms of the Homestead Act to get more land cheaply. So they would make their employees file claims and then make them hand over the right to the land and sell it on to them. So it was, again, fairly easy for the wealthy elites to control the land for themselves. Uh, it also required the Timber Culture Act in 1873, which meant that settlers could claim an extra 160 acres of land as long as they agreed to plant trees on 40 acres of that land. It did require that to further encourage migration. The opportunities to gain 320 acres was actually a lot more attractive than the initial terms of the Homestead Act in 1862. The other key piece of legislation in the 1860s was the Pacific Railroad Act, which created or facilitated the creation of the first transcontinental railroad, which was completed in 1869. Now, the route of the railroad, if you look at the map here, this shows you the sort of the development of the railroad network. Now, by 1862, the railroad system had developed fairly extensively in the east, in that land east of the Mississippi River here, but we see a lot of attempts to increase the scope of the railroad out to the west. And of course, the first attempt to do that is the Transcontinental Railroad, which, if you look at my arrow cursor here, is kind of going all this way across here, all the way to essentially to San Francisco there in California. And this was crucial because it made homesteading a much more viable option for people. Getting to the west suddenly was a matter of days rather than months. So it massively reduced transport times. It rendered the Oregon Trail obsolete, and it generated huge improvements for homesteading, for farming, and of course for the cattle industry, which would take off as a result of the railroad system. And of course, the Transcontinental Railroad was the first, but there were other railroad lines that would develop afterwards. You can see the Northern Pacific Railroad here, which is relevant in the story of the wars between the US government and the Plains Indians. For example, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Northern Pacific Railroad features as part of that. And of course, there were railroad lines down in the south as well through New Mexico and Arizona. And that's kind of what it looked like, the map of the railroad system there, just as that Transcontinental Railroad was being built. The Promontory Summit was where the final spike was driven in to the Transcontinental Railroad, because, of course, what you had was the two different companies starting at each end and meeting in the middle. So you have the Central Pacific starting in Sacramento and building eastwards, and Union Pacific starting in Omaha, Nebraska, and building westwards. And they met at the Promontory Summit in Utah, and that was a very famous moment when, in a sense, the two sides met and completed that railroad in 1869. Now, the railroad was hugely important. The slide here just shows you, and again, if you've got, you can access this PowerPoint on Show My Homework if you want to follow along yourself, or look at this in more detail. But you can see a lot of different impacts of the railroads highlighted. So we see impacts on farming in the blue here on the left. So you can see how the railroad encouraged travel to the west. It made it easier, but it also meant that crops and grain produced in the west could be easily transported to the east. And of course, that was significant because, of course, the east is where the big cities are. The east is where the customers are in those big cities: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and it was the ability to sell your goods to that big market. So those big markets in the east was significant. And it also meant that settlers could buy goods that were being produced in those industrial cities. So again, people were just much more connected. And that's kind of suggested at the top here, which is kind of talking about national impacts or impacts on the USA more broadly. Has huge impact on trade as well. Yeah, it helps open up trade with Asia now, as you could get goods from the east to the west coast, to San Francisco, which could then be transported by a ship to Japan or to China. And it opened up trade that way as well. And of course, the railroad had a massive impact on the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians were dreadfully affected by the railroad. Their buffalo herds were significantly affected because the grasslands that they relied on were reducing. The trains brought hunters to the plains that were looking to make money hunting buffalo in large numbers. Plains Indian tribes were forcibly removed from railroad routes, and their right to the land was extinguished as the railroad advanced. And the Plains Indians, not unsurprisingly, to defend themselves from this encroachment on their land, would attack railroad surveyors and constructors, and that would lead to conflict with the U.S. Army as well. And of course, it also had a big impact on the growth of the cattle industry, as we'll discuss in a later topic. And again, just a final point here, I mentioned about the land. The railroad companies were to make money from building the railroad, were given huge land grants. And you can see in the red shaded areas on this map, it shows you the land grants. These are huge areas of land, you know, thousands and thousands of square miles of land was given to the railroad companies to sell to people, and that again enabled certain very wealthy interests to buy up huge amounts of land and control it, particularly the cattle barons, as we'll see, really profit from being able to purchase land from the railroad companies. And of course, there was a dual relationship there, a reciprocal relationship that there'd be those cattle ranchers that would then use that railroad to transport their beef products back to the eastern United States, to cities like Chicago and so on. So that concludes this video on the Homestead Act and the Railroad Act. The next video we're going to look at is going to be looking at the final phase of migration, looking at the exodusters and the Oklahoma land rush.